Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Davis, and I am a member of the Rye Historical Society Board of Trustees. Each Sunday evening at 5 o'clock, we come together for History Happy Hour Live, and we are currently, if this is your first time joining us, in the middle of reading this book,
It's
Just
5 o'clock.
Rye Harbor. And we are at chapter 15, which if you're following along, we are at page 121. And this chapter is chapter 15, Last Wherry at Rye Harbor. Charles F. Marden, a longtime Rye resident, and by the way, I think that one of his ancestors or one of his descendants or relatives is Becky Marden, who is on our board. So that's sort of a fun little connection. But anyway, back to the chapter. Charles F. Marden, a longtime Rye resident, was born on Rye's Sandy Beach Road in 1864 and served at the Wallace Sands Life-Saving Station. Writing under the name Captain Truman Ordeon in the 1930s, he related the story of George Bruce Caswell and the last wherry of Rye Harbor. William Varell notes that Brewster Caswell was his grandfather's best friend and lived across the street on Washington Road. A wherry is a light, long rowboat made pointed at both ends and used to carry passengers in harbors and rivers. The wherries of Ipswich Bay fishermen were modeled after the English version and probably brought over on some early fishing vessels. They were between 20 and 30 feet in length, the largest ones called whale boats. They were all rigged the same, bluff bowed and rounded at the stern to a square 1 foot wide where the rudder was positioned. They carried foresails and mainsails. The foremast was, quote, stepped well forward, and the foresail showed more canvas than the main. The sails were rigged with a gaff and sprit, but had no boom. The rigging allowed fishermen to furl the sail around masts, unstep them, and stow them along the rail. Some were built with center boards. Ballast was stowed loose on a wherry's bottom covered with racks, so that if the boat capsized, the ballast would fall out and the boat would not sink. There were places in both the bow and the stern large enough to stow trawl tubs, oilcloth, and other items. George Bruce Caswell, son of a fisherman, was born on the beach road in 1844, one of 8 children. At 17, he volunteered to serve in the Army of the Potomac. After 3 years, he re-enlisted. He was often heard to say he had fought in 50 Civil War battles and skirmishes. Caswell's obituary states that during an early 1900s Civil War veteran's visit to Gettysburg, he was one of the party that went from this area. He was 5 feet, 7 inches tall, and round-shouldered, had a beard and a mustache, always had a pleasant nature about him, and was known as a very hard worker. At war's end, he returned to Sandy Beach to get back to fishing. He bought a small cottage on the Sandy Beach Road with an acre of land behind it, tilled this land, and had a flock of hens. One cold, bitter winter day, Caswell and elderly Captain Lear were out on the neck grounds hauling trawls when a squall truck suddenly capsized on the wherry. When a squall struck suddenly and capsized the wherry. The loose ballast fell out when the boat rolled over. The grapple fell off the bow, the rod line played out, and the grapple held. Captain Lear was weakened and helpless in his oilskins and red navy boots. Caswell, an excellent swimmer, got Lear on the wherry's bottom and hung on to the keel as seas washed over them. The Mary Jane Marden, captained by Gilbert Randall, was coming in from the southeast. It picked up both men and towed the wherry into Rye Harbor. Randall said Captain Lear was dead when they got him on board. They had to pound the ice off Caswell with a mallet. The wherry boatman made a good living fishing and carrying out sailing parties during the summer months. He eventually was appointed keeper of the Rye Beach, now Genesee Beach, life-saving station. He did not enjoy disciplining his rough crew and soon returned to fishing. Although other fishermen now used boats under power, Caswell stuck to his old wherry. On pleasant summer and fall days, one could find him off Little Cove Ledge or at the Neck grounds. Rye Harbor fishermen warned the by now old and shaky man to stay off the water because the vessel was no longer safe. Caswell would reply that his wherry was the last one still along the shore and that she would last as long as he did. Charles Marden, writing this piece in the early 1930s, reports that late one September, he saw Caswell off Little Cove Ledge, working hand line for cod. A boy was aboard the boat with Caswell. Although the weather had been decent all day, at 3 p.m, in came one of them smoky southerlies and it breezed up right smart. Caswell hoisted both sails and was headed for the harbor when both masts went down, splitting the wherry. The ballast fell out, and the boat stayed afloat. Captain Albert Remick, head of Rye Beach Life-Saving Station, happened to be at the harbor landing. He boarded his son Walter's power lobster boat and had him roar out of the harbor to save Caswell, with Albert steering and Walter at the throttle. Coming alongside the wherry, they cut clear the sails and spar and took the boy off. Caswell refused to leave, so Albert took the boat in tow. Marden saw Caswell pass by him on the way in, sitting on the windward rail, head up, feet and legs in the cold water. He yelled, "You all right, Captain?" Marden wrote, "His lips moved, but no sound comes. He's crying like a child." Not long after that, Captain Bruce went out with the tide one night to where a robe of white was given for his faded coat of blue. With his passing went a brave soldier, an able seaman, and a gentleman. That's the end of chapter 15. We'll go on, because that was a short chapter, to chapter 16. Captain Drake's Fire at Sea. And we've got a photograph at the start of the chapter on, looks like page 124. And the caption on the photograph says, Herbert Drake's Merganser underway in 1975. And here's a little story. A descendant of an early Rye settler, Herbert Drake has been a fixture around Rye Harbor since his early childhood. An innovative fisherman, he began using trawls, which are long lines with hooks, in the early 1960s, and was the first in the harbor to use gill nets in 1966. The nets had to be imported from Scotland and Germany. He was appointed to the New England Fishery Management Council as a New Hampshire representative in 1977 and served for 12 years. He also represented Rye in the New Hampshire legislature. Drake's long memory and photograph collection have added much to the creation of this book. So now, chapter 16, Captain Drake's Fire at Sea. The Boston Globe magazine of September 25, 1983, relates a harrowing experience of veteran commercial fisherman Herbert Drake, his son Jonathan, and crewman Raymond Mamone. Drake was a native of Rye whose ancestors landed in Hampton, New Hampshire in 1638. He had fished the waters off of Rye Harbor since 1946, when he returned to fishing after World War II service in the U.S. Merchant Marine and working as a civilian ambulance driver for the British 8th Army in North Africa. At 5 o'clock on a cold December 21st morning, Drake took his merganser, named for fish-eating duck, out of Rye Harbor. The vessel was a 55-foot fiberglass gill netter equipped with a large Caterpillar 3406 diesel engine, which the men could feel throb from the engine room beneath their feet. Hopefully, I'm going to give you a shot of this so you can see that picture of his ship that we're discussing. Drake had just changed his gill netting rig to Scottish purse seining, an expensive, tricky type of fishing with nets along the ocean's bottom. In a pile on the stern just forward of the two large net reels used for Scottish seining were 7,200 feet of weighted and buoyed monofilament gill nets that in a few hours would be fed over a goalpost type pipe arrangement into the sea. There was a 15 to 20 mile an hour breeze out of the west-northwest. The Globe's William Coughlin writes, scattered light flashes on the distant Isles of Shoals, the mile buoy just outside the Rye breakwater, Merganser's own white masthead running light, the few shore lights of the pre-dawn Rye, the great arc lights at the Seabrook nuclear plant construction to westward, and the distant blinking of Boone Island far to eastward, pierced the sky. The captain was on a quest to chase pollock, also spelled differently. I read it as Pollack. It's also spelled Pollock at Scanton Ledge, 10 miles east-southeast of the Isles of Shoals on the southern edge of Jeffreys Ledge. In spite of hit-or-miss fishing on the southern edge of that year, he hoped to return back to Rye Harbor that evening with between 20 and 50 boxes, 100 pounds each, of pollock, with perhaps a few lobsters added in. Judging from the first set of nets the men hauled in at 10:30 that morning, it would be a decent day of fishing. They had already taken in 25 boxes of fish, nearly all of it pollock with very few cod. Several hundred pounds of lobsters had also come up in the nets. Other vessels with Drake's friends and neighbors aboard were working Scanton Ledge that day. Ernie Hoyt from Kittery, Maine, in his Cindy Lou, Ronnie Choddy of Northampton, New Hampshire, far to the east, in his Tricia Lynn, and Raleigh Barnaby in his Libby B. These boats were all, like the Merganser, Bruno, and Stillman's, from the design of Royal Lowell. The Brunos often fished together. Now, let's go back in time. The Globe of December 25th, 1977, had reported that Drake and his friends complained of problems with their fiberglass Bruno and Stillman fishing vessels. The Merganser, the first Bruno 55-footer built in 1975, was mentioned in the 1977 story. The article stirred up strong feelings, pro and con, among fishermen, builders, insurers, and the bankers who financed the ships. There was a lengthy libel suit against the Globe, which was settled 5 years later in a New Hampshire courtroom. The company's boat molds were sold at a bankruptcy auction in 1983. To continue with our story, on this cold winter day, the captain had the boat on automatic pilot. He had topped off his tanks the previous day with 800 gallons of diesel fuel. The 40-pound propane bottle was full, as was the kerosene tank. There was extra lube oil aboard, and the 60-gallon hydraulic tank was full of red Dextron fluid for the functioning of the net hauler and reels. Drake suddenly noticed that the depth recorder had stopped working. Suspecting a blown fuse, he headed to the gallery doorway just to his left to check it. He opened the fuse panel and noticed an odor. He shut the panel door and took 2 steps across the galley to look below into the crew's sleeping quarters. Vapors and fumes hit his face. Staring hard at the location of the hydraulic pump, he could see a glow through the smoke and vapor. He backed out of the galley doorway and yelled, John, come quick, we've got a fire." Smoke was now billowing in great clouds through the starboard side of the pilot house. The father shouted, "Set the net, get it over, get it off her, get it off." The net was keeping the burning vessel tied at her stern and unable to maneuver. Without any warning came some kind of noiseless explosion. It blew out the Merganser's pilot house windows and drove the Drakes out into the open deck. Flames wrapped around the roof, engulfing everything: mast, booms, stays, radar, the life raft canister, and net buoys lashed on the roof. The whipping winds carried a tunnel of smoke and fire downwind to the southeast. No call could be made to the outside. The men could not get to the radio. To protect it from dampness and outside weather, it was fastened past the galley area where the fumes had first hit the captain's face. Jonathan Drake tried to reach the 15-pound carbon dioxide fire extinguisher, but smoke and toxic fumes had him gasping in seconds. He glanced over his shoulder and for the first time saw flames. Most of the vessel's life jackets were in a locker below in the galley, which was now a raging inferno. Writes reporter Coughlin, Herbert Drake had based his emergency plans on many years at sea. But today, as the flames, fed now by the petroleum-based fiberglass vessel itself, consumed the boat, everything was in the wrong place. Also, the 3 fishermen had no survival suits to keep them afloat and fight off hypothermia, as they had been making only short 14-mile runs to sea. John Drake, with his back to the wind, could feel intense heat and saw flames licking around his head. It was by some miracle, he thought, that his oilskins did not catch fire. It was difficult to hold on to that tossing rooftop in the choking smoke. John could not free the latch binding the life raft canister, so he pulled out a jackknife and cut the straps. He then had to fight to keep the 90-pound life raft canister from sliding away. He suddenly became aware of another hazard. The 25-foot steel mast and 20-foot boom over his head had begun to sway from side to side as the ship rolled. He also noticed that the fiberglass cabin roof on which he lay was feeding the flames below and melting, turning into a blazing, gooey mass. John held on to the heavy life raft canister and inched his way astern, his eyes and lungs ripped with searing fumes of toxic plastic smoke that kept him spinning. He finally made it and started to pass the container down to his father and Maimone. At this moment, a heavy sea staggered the merganser on the port side. The unopened white life raft canister was pulled from John's grasp and thrown into the sea. The men looked at each other grimly. Then Captain Drake issued a command. Jump. John Drake launched himself into the windswept 40-degree ocean of 6 to 8 foot seas without life jacket or survival suit, wearing heavy oilskins and boots. He surfaced, saw the canister beside him, and pulled hard on the jammed latch. The Avon 6-person raft jumped out of its hiding place and inflated. Maimone jumped into it and reached for the paddles that were contained in the small bag. He couldn't find them. Because the boat's stern was still held into the wind by the mile-long gill net, the rubber raft on the windward side was being blown hard against the hull of the ship. Captain Drake dove over the side to help Jonathan try and tow the raft away from the burning vessel. They looked up and saw the mast swaying in wider and wider circles. They were sure it would fall and crush them. Fortunately, the mast and boom fell to starboard, safely away from them. John Drake shouted out, "The propane." The 40-pound bottle on the ship's roof was being touched by flames and melting fiberglass. The men were certain it would blow up. The stern, where the net dragged overboard, suddenly burst into a ball of fire and began burning furiously. Apparently, the fire had traveled aft along the vessel's hydraulic lines, which were contained inside a 14-inch plastic tube under the wash rails. The polypropylene rope on the net reel caught fire from inside the hydraulic fittings on the reel and burned away, as did the plastic gill net itself. This was a blessing, because the merganser, freed from the net dragging out of its tail, now immediately started moving away from the life raft in the 25-mile-per-hour wind. In the meantime, Captain Ronciati on board his Trisha Lynn was headed home to Portsmouth in what he later remembered were rough seas. He glanced suddenly to the southwest and thought he caught a glimpse of smoke. He suddenly shouted, both at his crew and into the mic, "Jesus Christ, Drake's on fire." Calls now went out from Chatty and other boats of the Pollock fleet to the Coast Guard stations at Portsmouth and Newburyport. Within an hour, cutters reached the scene and tried to smother the merganser with foam. One Coast Guard commander ordered that the vessel be pumped full of water and then pumped out before it sank. The other boats kept several hundred yards away, since shotgun shells and .22 caliber rounds began going off about the merganser due to the excessive heat. Upon hearing the shots, men on one Coast Guard ship backed away from the boat. Captain Drake, Jonathan Drake, and Raymond Maimone were picked up by their friend Steve Driscoll on the Amanda Mai. They headed homeward at 1:30 in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock, the merganser, spouting a long column of black and gray smoke, dipped and sputtered in the cold seas. Then the boat rolled again and disappeared. That is the end of chapter 16. So we are going to meet again next week, next Sunday evening at 5 o'clock for Lobstering in the 1970s. In the meantime, if you haven't checked out our website, we are at rynhhistoricalsociety.org. We've got programs planned for this year. We'll be having those up on our website as soon as everything is confirmed, likely be via Zoom, as you can imagine. But we are looking forward to getting to know all of you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of the board members. You can call the number that is on the website or shoot us an email, and we'll be back in touch as soon as we can. We really appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more history of the town of Rye with you next week. Thank you so much, and cheers to a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.